Okay, welcome everyone. Fun with Budgets is today. I will let you trickle into the virtual room a little bit and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, welcome back to session 2 for Ready, Set, Grant. We're excited to have you all back with us today. If you're new to the session today, if you weren't able to join us last time, please introduce yourself in the chat so everybody can get to know you. As we mentioned last time, please stay muted when you're not speaking so you can hear the person who's talking. And if you can keep your camera on when you can, I appreciate being able to see all of your lovely faces when you're able to do that. We will once again have some opportunities to take notes and do some exercises that might help you to have something to write with or take notes with, however you like to do that. Last time we introduced the concept of one-on-one mentoring. Kelly Nonprofit Consulting provides up to 10 hours of one-on-one consultation on topics related to healthy nonprofits and fundraising and grant writing. I know that we have had at least 5 organizations signed up. Does anybody have any questions about that particular benefit of this course before we get any further? I will mention that Kristen is going to join us at the beginning of the session next week. Kristen Monahan from Kelly Nonprofit Consulting to answer any questions that you might have. So you'll have another opportunity to ask if you're still unclear about the kinds of help that she can provide. Okay, so we went over these last time. The group norms are basically a way to remind ourselves that we're all in a learning space here. We want to be kind and respectful to one another and make sure that people feel comfortable sharing their ideas and questions in the room. As we mentioned last time, we are going to have some opportunities for small group discussions on the topics that we're covering today. So if you are a person that for some reason is unable to join the small group discussions, whether you have issues with your audio or video, or if you have something going on at your house that is challenging in terms of small group discussion, just shoot Freya a message in the chat so that she knows. And what I think she told me she's going to do is she's just going to put all those people who are unable to participate in the small group discussions in one breakout room so that they can all be together. Is that right, Freya? Okay.
Yes.
The session is only 2 hours long today, as it was in the past. So just a reminder that we don't have a scheduled break, but take care of your needs as you wish. What are we going to talk about today? So we're going to focus on why it's important to diversify the sources of revenue that you're reaching out to run your operation and your nonprofit. We're going to talk about the concept of in-kind support. We're going to bring in again the idea about strategic planning that we talked about in session 1 and talk about how that fits in with your organizational budget. Talk about things like cost allocation methods, which we'll explain in a little bit, and different types of budgeting. Before we get started, I know that budgets can be daunting for some who are less fond of numbers, but what we're going to be focusing on is how you can use budgets to tell a story to your funder about your project, about the health of your organization, etc. Freya's got a quick little poll that she's going to put up for you a 1-question poll for you to respond to. And we would just like to know how many of you handle budgets for your organizations or who have some kind of familiarity with finance and budgeting. The reason we're asking this is if you are comfortable with budgets, numbers, or financial information, we'd welcome your help today by providing additional advice and suggestions, especially during the breakout sessions. So being able to sort of contribute to those conversations in a way that will help other people understand budgeting and finance. So it looks like we're about even. So that's good. That will mean that the discussions are have a lot of variety of experience in the room. So that's great. Okay, moving right along. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the importance of sort of diversifying the sources of revenue. And I want to just give you some information that will kind of inform that concept. Here's some information to give you an idea of how many nonprofits are out there looking for funds, how many philanthropic organizations are making grants to those nonprofits. I know some of you in the room are from other states, but I imagine the data for your state is likely similar. The takeaway here is I want you to think about how to make your organization more visible to funders and develop proposals that will get.
Oh, goodness, baby.
Whoops. We need somebody to go on mute. Thank you. So when you're thinking about making yourself more visible to funders, think about things like, how are you going to set yourself apart? Like what we talked about in the summary statement last time. Also, how you can partner with organizations to strengthen your project. We're going to talk a lot more about partnerships in a future session because it's an important way to make your funding proposals stronger. So another example I like to mention is I originally did a lot of work in Coos County, and we did a survey once and found out there was one nonprofit for every 10 residents of Coos County, just to give you an idea of how many are out there. So it's a competitive environment, and collaboration and making sure that you diversify your revenue sources is important to sustain your operation. So here's another little chart that gives you some bits of data about where money typically comes from for nonprofits. What we want to point out on this slide is that usually people think of nonprofits as mostly grant funded, but giving by individuals is consistently the best source of nonprofit funding. And you may have also heard of planned giving or giving by bequest, which is when someone leaves a donation to your organization as part of their estate or their will. I would say that there are a lot of situations where people are feeling like that's something they want to do in terms of their legacy, is to contribute to your organization as part of their estate. But sometimes that means that a large chunk of money is coming to your organization all at once. So let's say you have a $500,000 budget and somebody gives you a $200,000 bequest. That's a huge chunk of your budget. The thing I would caution you about is to be careful about just rolling that into your budget for day-to-day operations. You might want to consider setting that money aside if it's a large chunk of money for a special purpose, or creating an endowment. And we can talk about that a little bit more if that's something you're interested in. So as you can see from the slide, grant funding typically comes from government, it comes from foundations, or it comes from corporations. Sometimes people think that grants are the best way to raise funding for a nonprofit. Many of you here have probably heard when you approach people about donating to your organization, they say, why don't you just get some grants? There are tons of grants out there. It's very frustrating to hear that, because we all know, for those of us who have been doing this for a while, how challenging of an environment that is and how restricted grant giving is. So we're going to talk about the best types of funding for grants in a little bit. The other thing I want to mention on this slide is, remember that corporations will give to you not only because they are altruistic, but also because it makes their company look good. So if you're working with a corporation to try to get either a donation or a grant, because they do provide both of those things depending on the size of the company, just be hyper aware that they need to be recognized. Corporations are not going to want to be anonymous donors. So just some tidbits on that topic. The other thing I want to introduce is the concept of flexibility of revenue. So if you have been a nonprofit for a while, you know that grants are some of the most restrictive kind of money that you will get for your organization, because you're going to write a grant that has specifically laid out the project or a program that you're trying to fund, and it's going to have a very specific budget. And if it's approved, the funds must be used for that purpose. And there's not really that much wiggle room in that regard. These other types of funding that you see on the screen have a little bit less restriction on them, all the way up to unrestricted grants, which are less common. But basically, as we mentioned last time, that's when a funder just basically writes you a check and says, use it for whatever you need. So what I would say about this screen is to beware of grant dependency, because it kind of really gives you, it makes it challenging to run the day-to-day operation of your organization. Things like keep the light on, pay the insurance bill, keep the bookkeeper, hired and compensated. So think about what making sure that there's a mix of revenue types coming into your organization. It's not that restricted grants are bad, it's just that they serve a particular purpose and understand what the limitations are.
Jennifer, not sure if you saw this comment in the chat from Beth, just saying that she's interested in learning about endowments. And while it feels like a smart investment, it's really difficult to get started.
So Beth, great. Thank you for telling me that, Freya. Beth, what I would recommend, first of all, there's obviously the opportunity to meet with Kristen, Nonprofit Consulting, to dig into endowments a little bit. But the other thing I will tell you is, if you've ever had any interaction with Oregon Community Foundation, which Beth, I'm guessing you have, Oregon Community Foundation will work with you to set up an endowment. And they have legal expertise and they have a lot of experience in setting these up. And so if I was an Oregon person, I would recommend that. If you are a Washington or an Idaho person, typically it's a good idea to get some legal advice about setting up an endowment. And there may be an organization similar to Oregon Community Foundation in your state that you can approach to say, I've got a chunk of money, I need to set up an endowment, can you help me? So that would be my suggestion. Endowments are hard for boards sometimes because they've got this money in their hands and they're like, why do we have to, why are we keeping this for long-term use instead of spending it right now when we have so many needs, right? So that's sometimes a challenging conversation to have with your board of directors. But what I will say is that it's really good long-term thinking. The more you could get in an endowment, and I'm sure you guys all understand the math of this, if you have an endowment that's automatically giving you a certain dollar amount every year, $50,000 a year in interest, for example, if you can build up that endowment high enough, you have this great recurring source of unrestricted funding that really helps to sustain your organization. So I'm a big fan of endowments, but I understand why they're hard. So Beth, I hope that answers your question. Okay, so we're gonna, as we mentioned earlier, there are specific purposes that grants are really good for in terms of your organization's health and diversifying your revenue stream. So we're going to sit with this definition for a minute just to make sure everybody understands what we're saying here. The sentence says that for your grants, overall fund development grants are best considered as supplemental discretionary funding for activities already planned to occur 3 to 9 months in the future. So grants are a really good fit if you have new programs you're trying, or pilot programs as they're sometimes called, one-time capital projects where you're improving a building, buying a big piece of equipment. When you're trying to reach new populations that you haven't been able to connect with before, or if you're trying to do something to build your organization's capacity and make it better, whether that be around technology or training, things like that. So some examples of to describe supplemental funding would be, you run an after-school program, you want to start a coding class for young women, but you want to try it out first and give yourself some time to try to figure out where the long-term sustainable funding is going to come from. A grant is a great opportunity to sort of try that program out. Things that are already planned to occur. We talked a little bit last time about making sure that you make a plan and try to stick to your plan so that you don't get in this habit of trying to chase grants where there's money out there, and so you try to make your organization fit the money instead of the other way around. So for example, in 2023, your organization set a goal to provide marketing and training to downtown businesses. You want to find a grant to meet your goal, not the other way around, if that makes sense. So make sure it's part of your strategic plan, part of your mission. And then the 3 to 9 months from now, I think, is a common thing that if you've never been involved in the grant world before, that is a common thing that people don't know, which is the turnaround time from grants is pretty long. There are situations where they're going to ask you for a letter of interest, and then they may ask you for a full proposal, and then they've got to think about it for a while, and the wheels turn slowly a lot of times in grant land. And so if it's grant funding is not something that's good for immediate revenue needs because the time horizon is too long. I will say during the pandemic, this got turned on its head a little bit, as many of you know, where all of a sudden you would see a grant announced and it was due in 2 weeks and they were funding in a month. And I think it was just part of the emergency nature of the pandemic, but it was nutty because it does take a while to write a grant, which is, I guess, speaks to this idea of making sure that you're prepared by having your project charter or your case statement ready to go and have a strong understanding of what you need. Okay, so we're gonna, if there are any other questions in the chat, Freya, sorry. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna try a little exercise to get you involved in this conversation a little bit. We have, as a group, let's say we are going to work on a community playground project and we're looking for funding. What I'm going to do is show you a series of funding opportunities that people have presented to you. I'm going to show you one by one because that's the way it happens in real world nonprofit fundraising. They're not all going to come on the same day. So you can choose not to accept the donation or accept the donation. You can ask questions before you accept it. If a resource is chosen and it's restricted, you have to accept the restrictions that the donor has put on the resource. Another thing is if you accept a donation that wasn't part of your original budget scope or project scope, you're going to have to add the revenue and then the expense that goes with it. And we have an example that illustrates that. So here we go. The first thing that has been donated to us for our playground project is from a local arts and heritage organization. They have offered to give you 3 decorative benches for your playground. You did not have decorative benches in your budget, but this isn't necessarily a bad idea, right? So the total in-kind value, which means the total value, but they're not giving you in money, they're giving it to you in benches, is $3,000. There is a restriction in that you're going to have to add $1,200 to your budget in installation expenses to have those benches secured to new concrete pads. So what I'd like to hear from you guys, and you can either take yourself on mute or put it in the chat, is do we want to add this new expenditure and revenue to our project budget to accommodate this donation? What kinds of questions would you ask yourself before you decided to accept this donation? I saw Beth has her hand raised. Do you want to go ahead, Beth?
I just have a quick question. Is the overall budget of the project going to impact how we answer some of these questions? Because $1,200 for one budget might be really inky dinky, but it might be a whole lot for another budget.
That's a good question. So one of the questions I had listed in terms of things to consider is what percentage of the budget does this represent? So in other words, if the fact that they're giving you these benches is tripling your budget, that's a consideration as well. So that's a good question, Beth. What other things might you think of before you accept the grant?
I would want to know how many benches this is.
I think it says 3.
3, okay.
We have a few budget related comments in the chat. So what's our current budget? Do we have funds in the budget? Status of current budget? Can we afford to pay for the $1,200 for installation? And if we can, is the money we're using restricted?
Good question. Brandon, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to see, I would want to know what is maybe a long-term impact of this organization in the community. Since they have these benches in our park, would they be having?
Would they be, I'm sorry, your voice cut out a little bit.
Would they be having like get-togethers there? How would they be highlighting their benches in the future? How would they make their presence known in the fact that they gave us these benches?
Oh, right. So there's the specter of acknowledgement. How would they want to be recognized for their donation? What would their expectations be in terms of how these things are used? So that's a really good point. I also have on my list, what about the installation expenses? Do we think they're reasonable? Do we think we could find somebody to donate the labor? Do we want somebody to donate the labor for installation?
I would also want to know the amount of benches scalable. Do we need 3? Is it cheaper, better for our budget if we went with 2, maybe 1?
Yeah, oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, in other words, depending on the layout of the site, is this what we need to add, or do we need a different number? Or if these person donate 3 and we decide that that's a good idea and we'll seek 2 more. Great. Okay, let's try the next one. This is really good feedback. So let's see what else we've got. So the next one is a licensed and bonded contractor offers to supply all the construction materials and construction documents like the plans for $14,500. You had budgeted $18,000. So this would be a cost savings compared to your budget of $3,500. This one's a little more complicated. What kinds of questions do you think you would ask before you accepted this donation?
Well, it doesn't say that they're going to do the construction. It says the construction materials and the documents. Are
Mhm.
they going to do something in addition to the materials and documents? Or am I going to have to hire somebody to do the work?
Right. And so we can assume, I think for the purposes of this example, that we have a different line item in our budget that is the labor involved in the actual construction, but they're offering a different thing. They're offering just to supply materials and construction documents at a lower cost. And I think somebody mentioned in the last class that it's likely that what they're doing is basically giving you this at cost, and so that they've eliminated their profit margin, which is not an uncommon thing to happen.
Comment about complications in coordinating labor from a separate entity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. My main reservation with this particular resource is to be careful about donated labor. It's really hard when you haven't hired someone for pay to sort of hold their feet to the fire if things don't go well. Also, if they're offering to donate this to you, this automatically, and I'm presuming this, it may not be true. This may likely go to the bottom of their priority list in terms of projects they're working on. If they have projects they're getting paid more for, they will likely do those, and yours will have a lower priority. So I think, Faith, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, that $3,500 becomes an in-kind donation against the total cost of the project.
I believe so, yes.
Yes, and that's very common.
Correct. Very good point. So the other thing to think about is, are we sure this is a cost savings? Have we gone out to bid? Do we know, are we comfortable with these figures? Also researching the contractors to see if this person is in fact licensed and bonded, do some kind of a background work to make sure that they are a reputable organization. So let's try another one. I appreciate all your good comments. A community theater group offers to hold a special performance in your honor to benefit the fundraising that you're trying to do for this playground. They expect to raise, based on their experience, about $3,000, and they're going to donate half to your project. The restriction is that they need 10 volunteers to serve as ushers during the event. What kinds of questions would you ask yourself before you accept this?
I think just, do we have 10 volunteers?
That's a good, yeah.
And then also maybe you do, but you can't necessarily keep asking the same people over and over, so like if we ask them to do this, then are we not going to be able to ask them to do something else we need next month?
Yeah. Sounds like Audrey has a lot of experience with volunteer management. So that's good feedback. Anything else you would think about?
I'd want to know what happens if they raise more or less than the 3,000. Do we get more or less? Is there a minimum donation set if we supply 10 volunteers? I'd want to know a little bit more about that and what the expectations are for the volunteers.
Yeah, the expectations of the volunteers is good. In one of the previous classes, somebody mentioned that because this is for a playground project, it might be fun to get young people that would use the playground as volunteers, if that would work, just as a way for people to feel good about the project and to promote the project. So this is a great opportunity for awareness of your project, something to consider, and also a great opportunity to partner with another organization, which we always like. Okay, I got one more for you. The last thing you get in the door is a terrific donation letter that finds its way to Mr. and Mrs. Moneybags. I did not come up with this name. I'm not responsible for this. They take out a pen and write you a check for $20,000. What questions are you going to ask? This is after you're all, this is close to the end of the project. Faith, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, is it restricted?
Yes, that's the first question I would ask. Good thing. Anything else? Let's assume it's not. Beth, what do you think?
Do they have a timeline that they'd like it spent out by?
Very good question.
What type of grant do they think they're giving? Or what kind of money? Do they want it for an endowment? What do they want it for?
Right. So let's assume they're writing a check for the playground for $20,000. Let's also assume that this is more money than you need in light of all the previous donations we've discussed. This is not an uncommon occurrence. It's a lovely happening and we're all excited about. We have lots of money now for our playground. So we need to, this is where I want to introduce the idea of transparency, both with donors and with grant funders that might give you money. So this is an individual donor. This is not a grantor. You need to have a conversation with them, like Faith said, about how they want to be recognized, about what the money is for, but essentially lay it out on the line for them. Say, for example, our budget for this project was $20,000. We already have raised, 10 for the project, so we don't need 20, but come to them with a plan. Say, what we'd like to do is use the $10,000 of this donation to do the playground project, and we'd like to use the remaining 10 to do something related to the kids that will be using the playground, whether it be programming, or maybe you want to add more benches, or maybe you want to, basically have a conversation with them so they feel ownership of the contribution they've made to the project and they feel like they're partnering with you to make it happen. Does that make sense? So, and then the acknowledgement piece of this is important. As you know, if you've been working in this field for any length of time, there's sort of this spectrum of recognition. There are some people that are adamant about the fact that they do not want their name anywhere on this donation, right? Because and sometimes that's just because that's their value system, and sometimes it's because they're concerned about other people coming out of the woodwork to ask them for money. Then there's the other spectrum where they want to be recognized early and often and in a certain way. So it's really important to have that conversation so that you understand and develop a relationship with this person, particularly because it may result in additional donations for other projects down the road. Great.
Couple of comments in the chat. Just last one was adding upgrades to the project or set aside maintenance funds for the future.
Oh, maintenance funds. Excellent idea. Yeah.
And then a question about further Mrs. Moneybags. Would you like status updates?
Oh yeah, that's a great point too. So in other words, when you're having contact with funders or with donors, it's always great to not only reach out to them when you're asking them for money, but to continue to keep them informed of what your organization is up to so they continue to feel ownership. Obviously, they're giving to you because they believe in what you do, and so they want to hear about it. So I appreciate you bringing that up. That's a great point. Okay, so it's just some things to consider as takeaways from that exercise is what kinds of relationship building and question asking it takes to secure good community support. The fact that not all support is created equal. There is, the less restricted dollars are usually more valuable to your organization than the more restricted dollars, but it's not like we're going to turn down restricted dollars. We just need to be aware of what the limitations are. There's also this interesting idea of what do you do when someone offers you support you don't need, or you actually do find yourself in a position where you either want to redirect a contribution or turn it down altogether. That is a tricky conversation. It doesn't happen that often, but again, I recommend transparency and think about it as an opportunity for relationship building. Like, you're having a conversation with a funder or a donor that says, I appreciate your interest in our organization. Let's explore that a little bit. Let me explain the position that we're in, and we're not able to accept this donation at this time because of this reason, but we'd love to continue the conversation. And then two things that I am going to say over and over again to the extent that it probably drives you crazy. There are two things I'm going to harp on in these 5 sessions, and one of them is one of the most important things to getting funding is demonstrating community support. And Some of the different options that we talked about today are a great way to demonstrate community support to a funder. So if you're applying for a grant and you can say you have donated labor, you can say you have donated construction documents, you can say you partnered with the local arts organization to help raise money. These are all great ways to demonstrate community support. The second thing I'm going to that I'm going to talk about all the time is collaboration and partnerships, but we'll hit that a little bit later in one of the other sessions. So things to take away from this conversation so far is to use grants primarily for expansions, for new projects, and also to leverage other support. So foundations don't want to be the sole funder for one of your projects or programs. They want to be in a community of success. So they want to see community support. If they see that other funders are donating to the project, they're more likely to fund to you with you. And there is sort of this hierarchy in grant making where they want to see that you've been successful with some smaller grants before you apply for bigger ones. Faith, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I do. I just want to remind everyone that if you're doing a construction project, maintenance is always written into the grant. You don't think about that after. And also, since I've written a playground grant back in the day when nobody was funding playgrounds, extremely difficult. And we actually installed it on our Chiloquin Elementary School playground, which we had a huge need for. We partnered with Klamath County School District, and they took over the maintenance and also the liability. So it was a really a sweet partnership, and maintenance was not a problem. So if you're doing a playground, unless you own the land and own the park, you're going to have partners.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's also a really good example of the benefits of partnering with other organizations that are bringing different things to the table. So just to continue on this slide, we already talked about this, but funders will like to see a balanced funding profile. They want to see individual donations, business sponsorships, fundraising events, earned income, in addition to their grant funding. So that's the kind of thing that makes a project look healthy. It makes it look like lots of people are involved and there's a lot of momentum and energy around the project. Just remember that the reason we're talking about budgets today is not only because it gives you an opportunity to tell your story to a funder, but that grant funders and major donors are going to be paying attention to the details of your finances. Okay.
Jennifer, great question from Beth. She has a question about donated support from a local vendor. What happens if we have local community or vendor support, but then there are also policies in place that require 3 bids? What's the best way to address that?
Yeah. That's a challenging situation. I think that if it's a board policy, you can approach your board to see if that's a situation that they would want to override their 3 bid requirement, unless the 3 bid requirement is from from the state or federal government because of the nature of the funding that you're receiving. If you have a 3 bid requirement that's the result of a state or federal grant, I think that your hands are probably tied. But I can ask Kristen about that too. I'm curious what her opinion would be, and I'll get back to you.
I'm actually meeting with Kristen tomorrow morning, so
okay.
I can ask her that.
Okay, but I'll get back to the larger group too. And Beth, you want to share that when you come back next week?
I can do that.
Okay. Bids versus donated vendor. Good question. Okay, so let's talk about organizational budgets. So do you remember last time in session 1, we talked about this sort of through line where you have your mission and vision, and then that ties to your strategic plan, and then your strategic plan informs the programs that you're going to do as an organization, and making sure that you can explain the relationship with all of those things to each other to someone who you're requesting funding from. We also want to pull in the organization budget to this particular through line. In other words, let's make sure that somebody looks at your organization budget and says, yes, I can see that where the money is being spent in this organization is directly tied to their strategic plan, to their list of programs and services that they provide, and their mission and their vision. Sometimes when organizations drift from their mission, you can actually see it in their budget. You're like, why are they spending all this money over here on program X when their mission is something completely different from that? So I'm assuming that many of you go through some kind of an annual budgeting process as part of your organization, particularly those of you who are not nonprofits. If you're a government entity, you're going through a very well-defined budget process. So I understand that. I know these are really basic questions, but this is sort of the kinds of things to think about as you're moving forward here, which is how much is this all going to cost? How much have you raised so far? And what is your plan for raising the rest of the money? What I see in small nonprofits or those that are just getting off the ground is they're pretty clear that the first two questions need to be answered, but there's not always an intentional effort to create a plan for fundraising. In other words, we figured out we have a $500,000 budget. We think that the normal sources of income that we receive through fees and through other sources that are pretty solid are going to get us halfway there to $250,000. Do we have a plan for the rest of the money? Do we know what grants we're going to apply for? Do we know what events we're going to have and how much we think we're going to raise from those events, et cetera, et cetera. So that if you aren't doing that right now, I would suggest that that's something to think about to make your organization healthier. Also a discussion of if you have grant funding, how those expenses are going to be paid for in the future. It's because grants usually have a one-year duration. So if you want to keep doing something, you need to have a plan of how you're going to pay for that when the grant is over. So we gave you a handout. I know this is the simplest organization budget in the whole world. I'm doing this for the benefit of those who have never seen an organization budget. This was one of the handouts we provided for you. If you have your own organization budget in front of you and that's what you're working off of, more power to you. I hope that brings value to this session. There are a million different ways you can craft and organize an organizational budget. This is just a method that I prefer to use because I think it helps you find your funding gaps a little bit better, as we discussed earlier. Essentially, what it involves is creating a budget for each program or project that you are planning for your organization, considering the administrative costs that are not able to be charged to a program or a project and rolling all that up into a budget. We're going to talk about this a couple times, but the administrative costs that your organization has that can't be charged to a program are something that I would recommend that you look at really carefully. So for example, if you have a bookkeeper and your bookkeeper spends time accounting for a grant for program number 1, their time should be charged to program 1. You are trying to keep administrative costs low. Many grants when they ask you to submit a budget, they either won't allow you to include administrative costs in your budget, or they will restrict it to like 10%. The federal standard rate for a grant is 10%. Most of us, it's really hard to get to that figure. Most of us have administrative costs that are a higher percentage of that. And so you have to make a concerted effort to allocate those costs to your programs and think of a method that is defensible that you can use to do that. So that's just a side note. What we're going to do now is have a small group discussion so that you guys can talk amongst yourselves a little bit about what your experience has been with your organization related to your budget, thinking about where most of your organization's funding comes from. If you feel like you've got one funder that you're really dependent on, that may be an opportunity to sort of think about how you might diversify. Also, what are your organization's biggest expenses? I would say for probably 95% of us, that's going to be personnel. If we have staff, that's always the biggest expense. But are there opportunities to share resources or share FTE or personnel with other nonprofits, other governments, or otherwise cut costs by sharing expenses? And this is another great benefit of partnerships to think about. So this particular slide is not going to be visible in the breakout, so you can take a picture of it, or Freya will put the questions in the chat so you can refer back to them. But I'd just like you to have a conversation with each other about what you think is working well in terms of your budgeting process for your organization. What do you think needs help? And have the opportunity to sort of share ideas with each other in a small group discussion. And once again, I would call on the people who know a little bit more about budgets to sort of help those that are less familiar. So I appreciate your help with that. How we doing, Freya?
We are good. I'm going to open up the rooms now.
That makes sense. So I think we've got everybody back. I hope you guys were able to have some good discussions. Faith was just sharing about the struggles of finding staff in a rural place, particularly if you don't have the capacity to raise awareness of your organization in advance of trying to recruit staff. And that makes a lot of sense. Kim, did you want to share something that from your breakout?
Yeah, we talked about programmatic income because nonprofits, when we talk to them, program income allows you to spend without having those constraints that regular donations and sponsorships and grants have. And so if there is a way to work in a programmatic income, I feel like it's worth a conversation.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm familiar with the term programmatic income. What does that
So
mean
for
to you?
instance, I was giving an example of a local farm to table program, a nonprofit that works towards teaching children about food security. So there's a lot of going in between farms and the school district and things like that. And she had a donated space, so she was diversified. She was using a donated commercial kitchen from the school here in town. And when we met her, we who work with small businesses understand the need for a commercial kitchen. So we asked her, well, what would you think about championing a commercial kitchen for rental? And so we went and studied several models. We helped her. Together we wrote grants, and so now she's able to get income from the rental of the commercial kitchen.
Okay, so you,
that
so
she
I
serves.
know that is, I gotcha. I know that is fee for service. That's what I'm thinking of when you say programmatic income. So yes, that's fee for service is a great source of income to sustain your operation. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Did anybody else have any questions or comments from their breakouts? Okay. We will keep going. So we talked about organization budgets. So we were talking about basically for your overarching organization, you want to demonstrate your organization's health to a potential funder or donor by having a really clear organization budget, having a really good process for creating it as well, so that everybody, your board and staff are all bought into and understand the process of creating your budget, but also are able to use it as a tracking tool and a management tool. So now we're going to narrow a bit and talk about the budget just for the grant that you're trying to apply for or the funding that you're trying to find for your project. As we mentioned in the last session, one of the most important questions you should be able to answer is, what do you need? And I know that sounds really simple, but the way the budget fits into that is you could say something like, well, we could really use a couple of additional computers in our computer lab, or we could definitely use another staff person, as Faith mentioned, to help with this. But if you don't have a good grasp of what the expenses are related to that, then it's difficult to ask for what you need. So when somebody says, well, if you need that, how much does it cost? It helps if you have thought through the answer to those questions. Funding often comes to those most prepared to respond to opportunities as they present themselves. So almost all funders and major donors are going to require both an organizational budget, so they can kind of see how you're operating as an overall organization. And then they're also going to ask you for a project budget to be submitted along with your narrative application for funding. Funders request this information because they want to understand how their money is going to fit into the picture for the project and into your organization. As most of you know, organization budgets are typically created annually as part of some sort of organization-wide process. Project budgets sometimes have a different timeline, but hopefully they are considered, as we mentioned earlier, as part of your annual budget process as much as possible. A strong, well-informed, well-formatted project budget helps demonstrate strong financial management and planning practices. A really simple example I can think of is, I don't know how many budgets I have seen as a grant reviewer that didn't actually total to the number at the bottom of the budget. And I know that sounds silly, but sometimes when we get in the weeds on this stuff, we forget to check really simple things. So that's just an example. So ideally, your project budget and your organization budget are speaking to one another, or are easy to, it's easy for someone reading to see how they fit together. This means that what the for the most part, what you've included in your project budget should also be within your organization budget as a subset. One of the ways you can show that to a funder is to keep the line items the same. So if your organization budget has line items like personnel, materials, technology, insurance, utilities, et cetera, keep those descriptions the same for your project budget. I will say that capital projects, which is if you're building a building or a new piece or buying a new piece of equipment or resurfacing your parking lot or something like that, usually that's a separate animal. It's a separate budget. It's hard to show a one-time construction project as part of your regular day-to-day operations, if that makes sense. So that's the only sort of exception to that rule. And also the line items for capital projects are just way different animals. You're talking about things like design and engineering and other types of expenses that aren't typically part of your day-to-day operations. You're going to find that organizing your budgets this way is going to save you some time and make it much easier to keep track of the progress of your project, expenses, and reporting results to funders. So at the end of this grant that you receive from somebody after a year, you can say, you're going to go back to the funder and say, I spent your grant, I did all these really cool things with it. And a lot of times they're also going to ask you to update your project budget and show the actuals and show how you spent the money in each of those categories. So once again, we gave you this handout, super simple project budget, world's most simple project budget. This is very similar to, pardon me, I'm sorry, I just hit my mic. This is very similar to the way that we showed the organization budget in that you have each funder sort of divided into its own column for a particular program. I find this is the best way to find out where your funding gaps are. So in this example, we have Funder 1 is giving you $5,000 for your project. Funder 2 is giving you $2,500. Let's say Funder 2 doesn't allow you to fund salaries out of their grant. Sometimes that's a restriction of grant funding. This is a way you can show Funder 2 that they are not paying for any salaries. You can show them that somebody else is doing it. And then this also shows you that that Funder 1's expenses and are basically all covering personnel, whereas Funder 2 is providing a little bit extra, a little bit of extra money that you can use for other places, and then you can think about, because as you're developing this budget, how you would use their extra $1,750. Okay. So you do see that because of this, you have Funder 1 you think you can get $5,000 from, you have Funder 2 you think you can get $2,500 from, but your total budget is $14,250, and that's what you need to raise. So you know that you have to find $3,700 from somewhere in order to get this program off the ground. And so now you have a visual picture of what the gap is, and you can think through where you're going to find it. So other thing I would say though here is, if there are opportunities to have Funder 2 take up other expenses, and you can allocate from administrative costs to fund the project, then that might be another way to look at this. Any questions?
I would just say that on projects even, most funders I have found want to see some input to that project from the nonprofit. If they see it coming from, all funders, they don't seem to be as happy or excited to fund your budget as much. They want to see, the nonprofit help there.
Right. And I think that manifests itself as community support, because obviously you still have to get that money from somewhere.
Right.
So if you're saying you're going to contribute some of your fee for services or programmatic income, whatever you want to call it, you can put some of that in there. But if it's coming from other types of community support, like donations or in-kind donations, you can look at it that way. But essentially the way I would sort of tweak what you said would be to say they want to see demonstrated community support in one way or another. But I totally agree that you need to show some sort of skin in the game.
Right.
And then we have some comments in the chat. Ron is saying that we need to have the maintenance budget included in the operations plan when we do a capital project. And that was mentioned earlier, and that is absolutely true. So even though it may be difficult to show that your overall organization budget and your capital project are not necessarily congruent, you will want to show that you're absorbing those annual maintenance costs for your new building or whatever other project you're working on are included in your overall organization budget. The other thing is, how might this look when you are approaching your first funder? So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier when you are thinking about fundraising planning. So what the funder is going to ask you is what funding you have planned or secured. So in other words, you can say, okay, I am applying to the Ford Family Foundation for a project for $5,000. When I present the budget to them, I'm going to show them what their $5,000 is being used for. I'm going to say I have another funder at the $10,000 level who's secured because I've already got that grant. But then I am planning to apply for either 2 other grants, or I'm planning to get this amount of community support as part of the project. And so even though Ford Family Foundation might be the first funder you're approaching, you're going to have some planned applications or some planned community support listed under these different columns. And that reminds me, there was a question. I had a chance to review the chat while you guys were having your small group discussion. And one of the things that came up in the chat that I wanted to make sure to bring into the room to make sure we got it on the recording was that somebody asked a question about prevailing wage. And I want to make sure that concept is something that people know about. So if you're applying for a state or a federal grant, there's this concept of prevailing wage, which means if you receive money from the state, they are going to require you to pay contractors a certain wage in order to do the work that's part of that project. And that may be different from the market wage. It may be higher. There's also we call it Davis-Bacon. At the federal level, they have their own requirements for what the minimum wage should be for a particular project. So just be aware if you're getting money from the state or federal government that is a requirement to consider as part of your budgeting process. So if you are creating a project and you're thinking about what your sources of funding are going to be, if you think there are going to be state and federal sources mixed in there, make sure you're taking a close look at your personnel budget. So thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it. Okay. So sounds like some of you already know from prevailing wage. Is there anything else about project budgets that we want to bring up here before I move on? So I think we've touched on this sort of briefly, but this slide is going to show up in a couple of future sessions because the definitions of the types of grant funding that are out there are important to be clear about. And the reason for that is because funders will tell you what types of funding are available through their foundation. And it's going to fall into one or all 4 of these categories. Usually it's more like 1 or 2. So the most common type of grant funding you're going to see from a foundation is program funding, which supports a specific activity or group of activities like an after-school program or a program to train people to become entrepreneurs or start their own small businesses. There's a lot, it's basically a specific activity or group of activities that results in certain outcomes. So the types of expenses that you will see in a program budget are staffing, facilities, materials, food, childcare, liability insurance, things like that. Capital budget is probably the second most popular type of grant funding that you'll see out there. There will be foundations that say they only fund capital. And we talked about that budget a little bit, but that includes things like, depending on the project that you're doing, it can include things like design, engineering, construction, maintenance, as someone mentioned, insurance. A lot of times you will see capital project budgets in phases. In other words, you want to go out and look for the design phase of your project and get funding for that. And that will help you move on to the construction phase, which will help you move on to the maintenance phase. And so a lot of times people break those particular projects up into chunks rather than when they're going out to look for funding. Another type of grant you'll see is capacity building. Think of this as a way of making your organization better. So whether that is investment in infrastructure like technology or other types of processes or things that help you run better, board governance, training for your board members, people power. So if you need additional staff, a very popular capacity building grant would be to hire a development director to help you with raise money and keep your organization sustainable. If you need funding to bring in a consultant to help you with visioning or to help you become better at fundraising, paying for that consultant to help you with that process could be considered a capacity building grant. Capacity building expenses typically include things like training, software, hardware, or some kind of expertise that you're bringing in to make your organization better. The last one is general operating grants. These are essentially when a foundation would write you a check and say, do whatever you want with it. For those of us who have been in the nonprofit world for a long time, we know these aren't very common. Typically, you have to have a really strong relationship with a funder for them to feel comfortable doing this. I will say that during the pandemic, these became more popular because people recognized that nonprofits were doing a lot of the work on the ground to help people recover from the pandemic, and they just started writing checks, and it was great. Whether or not that trend will continue, I have no idea, but it was nice to see. There's this term called trust-based philanthropy that's very popular with foundations now, where they're trying to do more things that look like general operating grants and develop stronger relationships with nonprofits and trust that they know where the money is needed. Are there any questions about these different categories, or is this somewhat clear? I just want to make sure you're familiar with these terms because you're going to see them when you research funders. And so I want to make sure you're clear on the distinction. So when you write a grant, you're going to have lots of opportunities to tell your story in words and explain why you need the project, explain why your organization is qualified to do it, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this other opportunity to tell a story with the numbers. Can someone looking at your budget understand what it is that you're trying to do without reading your grant? So, you know, when we write something and we give it to somebody who's fresh eyes, basically, or somebody who's not affiliated with your organization and ask them to read it to see if it's clear, you could also consider doing the same thing with your project budget, you know, showing it to somebody and saying, does this all look like, does it make sense to you? Do you understand what we're trying to accomplish here? We want the funder to be able to see their impact by looking at their budget. One thing I would caution you about is to make sure you don't, when you create this budget document, don't leave funders guessing as to where their funding is going to be applied. Make it really clear. In the example I showed you, I like to give the funder their own columns so they can see exactly what expenses they're covering. Any effort to sort of hide is a strong word, but to sort of mush it all together is going to be confusing to the person trying to figure out whether or not they want to give you money. So also, there's sometimes a tendency to lump together expenses. So when you're presenting a project budget, to just say personnel, other project expenses, and just leave it like that. I would recommend that you break that down a little bit and provide detail about supplies, catering. You know, I almost get as specific as to say, we need one staff member for 10 hours a week for 3 months to do this project, so that they can see exactly how you've created your budget and what they will be funding. Beth, did you have a question or comment?
I had a question about the like identifying where the funding is going to go for each funder. Does that kind of lock you into restricting your funds for whatever is presented in that grant, or is there a way to present that in a way that leaves some flexibility for the program? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. So I think what you're saying is, for example, if you told funder number 1 that they were going to fund staffing, and then you decided that funder number 2 was going to share in that and that they weren't going to fund as much, I think there's this sort of specter of materiality. What I mean to say is that if you're talking about small changes in the line items, I think that a funder will be okay with that. They're not expecting your actual expenses to be dollar for dollar what you budgeted. But what I would say is I think they're going to expect them to be in the general range. So I think that if you are going way far afield, I would, if it were mine, I would probably reach out to the funder and say, here's the situation we're in. We want to make a little shift here. Is that okay? If it was my proposal, I would still try to be as clear as possible in the proposal itself about where their money was going. And I would not attempt to be squishy in the proposal, but what I might do on the back end is if there were circumstances that came up that made it so that I was concerned that the funder would be surprised by the report of expenses that we provide at the end of the grant, I would want to give them a heads up and make sure they were okay with that. But that's just flat out my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about how do you determine how much administrative costs are going to be?
So that's a $1 million question, Connie. So I think when you're creating your budget, right, you're going to know how much your executive director costs a year. You're going to know how much your bookkeeper costs a year. And when you create sort of that basic personnel budget, and that's honestly where RDI starts. The first thing we do, because we are a people-powered organization, is we create our personnel budget. And so we know how much it's going to cost to pay all of our staff in a given year. And then we start charging their time to programs. We're like, okay, Jennifer this year is going to work on Ready, Set, Grant. She's going to work on, X, Y, and Z. And we charge people's time out to programs. And that is our second step. And then at some point, we've got some leftover money. So let's say Jennifer charges her time to 10 different programs, but that doesn't cover her whole salary because she's still got, 20% of her salary that's just left doing administrative stuff like answering emails from people, right? That's going to sort of determine what your administrative costs are, is all that sort of excess leftover. And what I would say is if you find that is hitting in sort of the 20% range, that's pretty typical. I will say that most funders are going to want to see more like 10%. So you may have to go back to the drawing board and try to figure out how you can just allocate more administrative costs into programs. Or you just sort of have to know that your administrative costs are 20%. We think 10% of those costs are going to be absorbed by grant funding. We're going to have to look for other sources of revenue for the other 10%. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, or did I talk around it too much? Okay.
No, I'm finding this is way more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the reason I'm sort of hesitating here is administrative costs are hard. And the reason they're hard is because funders don't understand what it takes sometimes to run a nonprofit organization or to run a government, right? They don't see that we have to have, telephones, we have to have, computers, we have to have human beings that do these programs that sometimes don't get covered by the funding that they provide. So just to get like way into the rabbit hole here, we have conversations with funders a lot because we represent rural, right? And so a lot of times funders will approach us and say, tell us how we can better fund in rural. And one of the answers is always increase your allowable administrative overhead, because people can't run their organizations, on the administrative percentages that you're giving us, or the fact that you don't allow administrative costs at all. You know what I mean? So it's an ongoing conversation. Okay.
Faith, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry, I missed your hand, Faith. Please go ahead.
No problem. I just want to clarify too, the difference between a contractor and an employee. A lot of us have staffing comes in with the project. Sometimes it remains, sometimes not. A contractor is responsible for their taxes, so you have a set wage that you're going to pay them, and it's really easy. But if you're hiring staff, then you say you have $20 an hour times $10 a week times 52, you put in your grant 10.4K, and it's not going to be enough to fund that person for that year because there's employer taxes, and that is on the federal side and on the state side, and that comes directly out of the project budget. The organization does not pay that, or you're going to find yourself going into the hole very quickly, especially with the state of Oregon. They have so many new taxes and a lot of them have gone up. So when you factor in staffing in a grant, make sure you factor in employer taxes. It's very important.
Yeah, that's a good point, Faith. So when you think about what you're paying a person, it's not just their wage, it's wage plus taxes plus benefits. And that number is what should be included in your budget. I'm glad you brought up contractors. Contractors is sometimes a way for organizations to remain flexible. In other words, if you're waiting for a grant and you don't know if you're going to have the staffing for it or not, being able to just pull in a contractor to do a program is a nice way to be flexible and not impact your organization's budget as much and your organization's sustainability as much. The thing I will caution you about that you can get in trouble with is make sure they really are a contractor. There are laws about who is a contractor and whether or not they've actually set themselves up as a business with a business license, and you need to ask some questions to make sure that person is actually a contractor as defined by the government. What else do we have in the chart? Ron, did you have a question about performers, or do you want to talk about performers?
Oh, no, I think it goes back to Connie's question. My point is, I think having the best understanding as you can about how you think your business, profit or not, is going to perform. And so the first thing that I would do would outline all of what my anticipated expenses are, fixed and variable, and what I anticipate my revenue stream to be, whether it's fee for service or grant awards or what, to really know where you're going to be at any given point in time. That's the first thing I would do to see if it's even sustainable. I agree with several of the comments that beyond getting the award for whether it's a fixed asset or ongoing expenses, I think most grantors are going to want to see that you can sustain it. We're in the process of receiving a senior center in a county where the value is at $1.4 million. Sounds great. But the expense to manage that on a yearly basis, just in maintenance and utilities and such, is about $200,000. So on the surface, yeah, take it. It's free.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to take a hard look at what it costs to own that piece of property. So that was my only point. And a pro forma is one way of looking at that. And then to your contractor, I think most people have asked for a W-9, which in most cases would give you most of what you're looking for, and whether or not a contractor is set up that way.
Right. So that's a good point. So the pro forma essentially is a long-term budget. So if what you're trying to do is figure out, as Ron said, yeah, we could pay for it this year, but what happens for the next 5 years? What are our ongoing expenses? And sometimes if you're doing a big project, it helps to spend the time to think about what the long-term expenses look like for a project. So that's what a pro forma looks like, and that's why it can be a useful tool. And I think that is particularly true of the type of projects that Ron's talking about, which is a big capital project or a big influx of cash for a project that you weren't expecting. Okay, so we already talked about this, I think, a little bit, but just to bring the point home, showing a balanced mix of funding for your project demonstrates to the funder that you have support from your community, that you have support from fees that you're charging for the service, or whatever the diversity of funding is. It gives you a stronger proposal, and it gives you a stronger chance of continuing the program without outside grant support. So funders want to get you on your feet is one way to think of it. Foundations want to get you started on this project, but they're not going to be there forever. So they want to know, as Ron mentioned, how you're going to be able to continue this thing. And so honestly, it sounds like a lot of work for a grant proposal to have to make all of these, justifications and arguments. But one of the favors they're doing for us is getting us to plan. Does that make sense? by asking the questions that they ask as part of requesting funding, they're helping us think through and fully plan the project into the future to make sure it's sustainable and to make sure that they are making a sound investment. So let's talk for a minute, just because this ends up being a big discussion item for in the nonprofit world, at least. I'm not as sure about the government world. Maybe someone else can help us understand that a little bit better. There's this concept of in-kind support, which is basically people who are giving you things that aren't money. Some examples. People might, the building you're using to provide your programs, the landlord might give you a nonprofit discount compared to other people that he's renting to in the building. Donated projects or services that they might donate equipment for after-school programs for sports. And the most common one, I think, is volunteer time, where in the example I put here is a local dentist volunteers 5 hours a month to provide cleanings at a free clinic. So when it comes to budgeting, in-kind support can be a little bit tricky. As we discussed earlier, when we were talking about the playground example, it can artificially inflate your budget to a point where it's not a realistic budget anymore. So have a moment where you decide whether or not you want to include non-cash contributions. Some of them, like the rent office space, the $200 a month nonprofit discount, that feels pretty quantifiable and pretty able to justify. So I could include that in a budget, for example, for a particular project or for my organization. The local dentist volunteering 5 hours a month. The dentist knows how much they charge an hour, right? They know how much, they know their costs to that level of specificity, so they can give you some information about what the value is of those 5 hours per month. If you're talking about a volunteer opportunity where, let's say you have the local Rotary Club coming out to help you refurbish a park and do some work during the day, and you have 20 volunteers, I'm not sure I would quantify that time. I know that other people who work in this field may feel a little more confident doing that. I would not necessarily put a numeric value in my budget. However, volunteer time, like I just described, tremendously and excellently demonstrates community support. So in the narrative for that grant, I would say the local Rotary Club plans to donate their time to do this, which is reducing the cost of the project budget for us, if that makes sense. So I think that one of the piece of advice I would give to you here is, if you're not already tracking in-kind contributions in some way, I would recommend creating some kind of a process to start tracking that, because it demonstrates community support, and because in some cases the dollar value is something that's worth reporting or including in your budget. But that's sort of a case-by-case scenario in terms of whether or not you want to do that. I know that was a very fast discussion of in-kind support. I know that there are probably people with a bit more financial experience than I have in the room that can probably speak to this a little bit more. But if you have somebody who is an accountant on your board or as part of your organization, they can demonstrate how this can be accounted for in your accounting system or your bookkeeping system as well. Any other comments or questions about in-kind support or other examples that you have from your own work? I know, for example, that you can look online and there's some organization that quantifies what an hour of volunteer time is worth. I stay away from that. So the Rotary Club that's doing the day in the park, the internet may say that their value is $25 an hour. That number ends up getting so high when you count up all the hours that it really, I think, distorts your budget. So I wouldn't do it, but that's just my opinion.
I'm just really glad that you brought this up. This never occurred to me to include all of this in-kind support in our budget, which is nice because now our budget looks much better because we rely on this constantly. For example, facility maintenance, we have just generous volunteers who do so much just to keep the building running. And of course, to hire someone would just be exorbitant.
Right. Yep, it's a good thing to keep track of. Beth, did you want to ask a question or put a comment in the room?
Well, it's under donated products and services, but like we have a contractor who is willing to just wipe out their profit margin on the building that we're looking to build. And so that we will put in our budget as a, because we would have had to pay for it, but they are taking that out, and that's a heavy percentage of that budget.
And it's
So-
also very quantifiable to, it sounds like to me, like you can be really comfortable with that number.
Right, exactly.
Anything else? Okay, we're going to play with numbers again. So when you think about the summary statement that we created in the first session, so if you have a priority project that you're working on as part of these, these 5 sessions, take that project or take that summary statement. And what we want you to do in these breakout groups is kind of brainstorm what expenses you think are going to, you're going to incur. And the reason it's nice to do this in a small group is because your compatriots will all have experience doing this and can offer different things, expenses that maybe you didn't think of. What they can also offer is how you figure out what that number is, because what I'm not asking you to do is say, you don't need to know exact figures for this exercise. What you need to know is what you have to go figure out, if that makes sense. In other words, oh, I'm going to build a playground. I'm going to need to see if our liability insurance needs to be increased to cover that and what expenses that would be. And who can I ask that? I can ask my insurance agent, right? So just think about like how you're going to get there, and think about the project you're working on and how you would develop that budget. If you already have a budget, you can go into this budget activity and say, talk through what you've already got and see if other people have suggestions and ideas about how to make it better. Okay. So I will pass it to Freya.
All right, we're all set, and I'm going to open up the rooms now.
All right, are there any questions or comments that came out of your discussions that you want to talk about with the full group? Anything you learned? Anything you're curious about?
Something came up at the very end of our breakout that I'd like to get some insight on. So a group member asked me if I had budgeted for transportation, and I had not made it like its own line item. In terms of reimbursing the personnel for mileage, there's definitely will be travel involved for this program. We took maybe this was just the path of least resistance, but we're just going to say that that's covered in our administrative percentage, because this grant opportunity allowed us to put 10% of the total amount for overhead. And so we were like, that's just part of overhead. But is that necessarily a good approach, or is it just kind of depend on the parameters of the grant? I have just a little bit of feedback on how much transportation, regardless of what form it is.
I think if it were my grant, I think it depends on what the funder is asking you for, but my default is usually if I can pull it out of admin, I will. So making travel a line item is, I think, probably a more transparent way to go. Do other people have other thoughts on that before we see what Rachel wants to contribute?
Yeah, travel expense is definitely an important one.
Yeah.
And events can sometimes be one that people don't see. So like if you have to communicate or do outreach, I can sometimes follow and do that, but there can also be event attendance or things like that.
Oh, you mean like going to conferences and things yeah, I mean, going to conferences, you can obviously put in your budget if you're doing capacity building. So if it's a training or staff development opportunity, putting that in the budget makes a lot of sense, particularly if it's specifically related to the capacity you're trying to build as part of your request, for sure. Anybody else? Rachel.
A few of us in our group were discussing how to gather demographics, how that can be a challenge because it's something a lot of funders are interested in, but on the other hand, it can also create a burden or just feel like an imposition or create barriers for this population that we're trying to serve. So I was just wondering if there was a good way to gather demographics.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you're bringing up, because as you said, funders love to see the data around your programs, and they love to see the populations that you're serving and whether they're diverse or not. It's a way of showing diversity and that you're doing outreach to, a lot of different populations. But that particular task takes a tremendous amount of time. Freya, for example, on our team, that's like one of her big jobs at RDI is to collect data on all the programs that we do, and it's huge. So, kind of earlier in the session when we talked about the fact that funders don't understand what it's like to run a nonprofit, I think this is another example of funders don't understand what it's like to have to track all of this data. And sometimes there are opportunities to have conversations about that, to see what their expectations are. Barring that, I think maybe Freya, I'll let you chime in after I'm finished, but I think from RDI's point of view, we try to choose the path of least resistance. So for example, you probably noticed when you registered for this program, we asked you demographic information. So our approach is usually, if we can get it, we'll get it. And if we can't, we can't, you know what I mean? Like we try, but if it's not something that's easy to get, then we'll explain that as part of our grant proposal. So if the grant proposal asks, how will you be evaluating your success? The fact that you have the ability to define that is helpful to you. So you can think about, what's the path of least resistance here? What is it that I can collect that's not going to be an undue burden on me or my staff, that will report on the success of this project? And hopefully they let you define it as opposed to them defining it for you. So for example, we get a lot of grant funding from banks and financial institutions because we do a lot of economic development work. And because they are required to comply with the Community Reinvestment Act metrics, they provide all the metrics and we have to try to comply with them. So sometimes and it's usually a laundry list of stuff. And we will say, we can provide these 10 things, we cannot provide these other 7 things you're looking for because we don't track it. And I know that's a risk, but I think that there is an understanding that if you're a nonprofit, sometimes you just don't have the resources to keep track of all this stuff. That being said, I think, sorry, I'm going on a riff here, but the demographic information is really helpful to organization management. And it is helpful to know, like, who is it that we're reaching and who are we missing? And so if there are ways to get that data, it's certainly helpful. Freya, I will be quiet now for a minute and see if you have anything to add based on your experience.
Just in terms of our internal demographic data collection, we try to standardize the questions and keep them to a simple set as much as possible. Obviously, there's exceptions where certain funders might require certain metrics, but we really try to keep our set very simple, very basic. And then we always ask them, but we always make responding optional, just to kind of help reduce those barriers. And we've shifted for race and groups and ethnicities, kind of having a select all that apply and listing other types of groups under that same question as well. Because we found that rather than make a 10 question list of demographic question, that's kind of has reduced the number of questions that we need, and we can gather a lot of information just in that one question.
Does anybody else want to lend their experience to that question? How do you do data gathering to provide demographics, not only for your grant proposals, but for your grant reporting?
Well, we are fairly lucky that our city does a lot of demographics, but we serve a lot of people outside the city limits. Mm-hmm. And so we have done Survey Monkeys on the internet and just send them out to all our membership for the senior center. And we get a lot of extra demographics and very different demographics that live within the city limits.
That's great. Anybody else?
I know that the Ford Family Foundation puts out a book that has a lot of demographics in it for each county for Oregon.
Yeah, that's true. That's good. That's a good source, Allison. So Oregon by the Numbers is what it's
Yeah.
called, and you can download it for free off their website.
Correct.
And that's, I think it's by county, right, Allison?
Yes.
So I guess and we'll talk about this more when we talk about how to put together your grant proposals in a later session, but there's two types of demographic information, right? There's what Allison's talking about, which is, stuff that they're pulling from the census or other sources of information that are external to your organization. And then there's data that you could collect within your organization from your client base. And both of those have value. I would suggest the data that you collect yourself probably has more value, but sometimes if you're starting a new program, you're not able to demonstrate need. So you might have to go to external data about the community or a county to sort of demonstrate numerically or quantitatively what it is that you call it quantitatively. Yeah, sorry, I got mixed up there for a minute.
Yeah, if I can't figure out, what my demographics are ahead of time, I use that as my resource. But then definitely, as you get going, as you do your grant reporting, you're going to have those numbers, obviously. And so I utilize the hard numbers that we have.
Great. Faith, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, we're doing currently doing a fuels survey and reduction in our community. And the first thing we did was we sent out a survey, and a grant was written specifically for that survey to get that data back. So if you have a big project that is as important as fuels reduction in your community or surrounding public lands, you think way ahead and try and get a survey so that you have some current data other than the census to work from. And that community involvement, funders love it when you can show that you have done a survey and here's the results. And now we would like to request grant monies to implement or whatever. That's
Right.
really helpful.
Faith, you're bringing up a good point. When we think about what the project is, the project might be in, we talked about capital projects being in phases. Other types of projects can also be in phases. So if you want funding to plan your project, particularly if it's large in scope, you can get funding to plan your project the way that Faith described. Smaller projects, sometimes it's hard to make that justification, but sometimes the fact that it helps you become prepared for the funding down the road is something that appeals to people who want to give you money. They're like, we want to help you get yourself organized. We think this is a good cause. And we understand that you're going to need to pull together data. You're going to need to do assessments. You're going to need to, create construction plans, et cetera, in order to get off the ground and figure out exactly what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So I'm glad you brought that up. Anything else on that topic or any other topics? We're kind of off topic a little, but that's okay. Let's see. I'm just reading the chat a little bit. Oregon by the Numbers. Oh yeah, somebody said comparing external to internal data gives you useful information. That's completely valid fact. So that's good stuff. Okay. So last time we talked about this concept of a project charter or a case statement where you can sort of pull together all the components of your project throughout these 5 sessions. And at the end of our time together, you will have at least the bare bones of a proposal that you can use to write grants or to ask a major donor for funding. So now that we've created a summary statement that, like we did last time, we can also add a project budget to that proposal. So we have done 2 things. And then to revisit this slide, which we saw in the first session, these are just the common elements that are requested as part of a grant proposal. How does the project budget fit into this? Your organization budget kind of speaks to the health of your organization. The project budget speaks to the project request. It also helps you determine the project start and end date, the different activities that will occur, have price tags attached to them, and so does the implementation plan. So you have numbers that you can attach to some of these different aspects of your proposal. So I want to take a minute to think about what new knowledge or skills are you taking away today that are going to be helpful to your organization? And if there's something you think you might do differently as a result of what we've talked about today or in any of the sessions so far. Just curious if you have any feedback for us about what aspects of this are particularly useful to you to help us make sure that we tailor this training in the future to the kinds of things that you need.
Well, for me, it was the link to Oregon by the numbers. I've been toying with the idea of how I get that information and different things I've heard or seen in writing. That is a fantastic link. So I appreciate that.
Oh, that's great, Ron. Yeah, they put it out every year.
Yeah.
Faith, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, I want to thank you guys for putting this on. I've written a lot of grants, but the grant writing world and the funding world has changed dramatically since COVID. And so a lot of this information is so good, not only for review, but to see where the focus is heading in the future. Very, very good. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Faith. What can I ask you, since you have some experience with grants, what changes have you seen as a result of the pandemic? I know what our impressions are, but I'm curious to what you're experiencing.
Some of the turnaround times are amazing, like you mentioned earlier. Also organizational, grants to run an organization. OCF has 2 competitive grants coming up. The letter of inquiry is due this month. A lot of organizations are going to a letter of inquiry. That used to not be common, but I think it's becoming more common because of the competitive nature of grants. And just the other thing is NAO is advocating on the state level, which is a huge thing. If you guys don't know NAO, go to their website, see what they're doing, advocating for all nonprofits in the granting world, the foundational world. So there's huge changes going on, not on the state and national level, just huge.
So NAO is the Nonprofit Association of Oregon, if that acronym is unfamiliar to you. And if you are in Washington or Idaho, there are sister organizations. There's the Idaho Nonprofit Center and then the Washington Association of Nonprofits, and a great resource for information if you're nonprofits. And Faith is right, they recently hired an advocacy director who's doing wonderful things to try to make changes at the state and federal level around the nonprofit environment. So thanks for those contributions. Anything else? Oh, Audrey put a nice census resource in the chat, so thank you for that. Okay. Okay, so homework. If you started creating a project for your budget, or if that's something you're doing as part of these sessions, you can continue on that path, research the expenses and consider what funding sources you might want to approach. The next session is going to be more on how you identify funders and how to do funding research. So that's what we're going to do next week. Being able to answer the question for your organization, what do you need, and include numbers with that. How much does it cost? And being able to keep that answer up to date is a process that you might want to somehow include in your organization's day-to-day operations. And then taking a look at your organization's budget, making sure you understand where the gaps are, making sure you have a process to identify those gaps, and creating a plan so you know how you're going to meet them. Okay. So we're going to see you again next week at same time, same bat location. And thanks again to Ford Family Foundation and Sherwood Trust for supporting our efforts. And I will go ahead and stop the share. We are at 11:50.